Welcome back for another online lecture with Mr. Regas. Today we're going to start our discussion about World War II. Now this is a big event, so it's going to take some time. This lecture is going to be specifically looking at the causes of World War II. What good is talking about an event if you don't know why it happened? If anything, this is the more important part of all of this. Why did we get to the point that the world entered the most deadly conflict in human history? Obviously, there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. We're going to look at a few of them. Little bit about World War II, just so you know how big of an event this was. This was the most destructive conflict in world history. Nothing really comes close. This is in terms of both damage to land, business, and death. We have battles on all continents except Antarctica. Lasted over 6 years. And an estimated 70 to 85 million people were killed here. That's approximately 3% of the world's population at the time. So these numbers are staggering. 24 million military personnel. That number isn't drastically different than World War I. However, look at the next number. 50 to 55 million civilians were killed. So this includes the Holocaust and the Holodomor, both things we're going to be talking about in greater detail later on in the course. Most of these deaths were civilians in the USSR and China. Now, again, there's some huge variance in the estimates of people killed here, like 70 to 85 million. That's a big gap. Now, part of this is that the killing was in such large numbers, it just wasn't recorded with accuracy at all times. But this gives you an idea of the magnitude of it. Again, comparing this to something like World War I, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of civilians being targeted here. Now, the impact on Canada briefly. So the Canadian War Museum states that there were 42,000 soldiers killed, plus another 1,600 in the Merchant Navy, and another 700 from Newfoundland. Now, Newfoundland at the time was a part of the United Kingdom until 1949, when it joined Canada. So this is just a very quick look at how much destruction happened in World War II. We're going to be focusing on four main causes of World War II. Again, an event with magnitude like World War II, it's hard to actually narrow it down to just a few different causes, but each of these has more elements to it. There are some historians who actually consider World War I to the end of World War II kind of as one event, with the interwar period being part of it all. Now, this does make sense to a certain extent, and you'll see why. The events of World War I are explicitly linked to the causes of World War II. So let's get into this. Our first cause of World War II, the Great Depression. This isn't just a bunch of sad people on Xanax. This is one of the worst economic periods, at least in recent history. Now, whether or not one specific event actually triggered the Great Depression is debated. So there are different viewpoints within the economic sphere that people argue. However, there are several key reasons why it happened. One of these was on October 29th, 1929. It's called Black Tuesday. Here, the American stock market crashed. This crash of stock prices led to a period of economic decline known as the Great Depression. Here you see unemployment skyrocketing. Now, this is across both North America and Europe. In the USA, it hit numbers of 25 to 30%. Now, comparing this with something like the Great Recession of 2008, unemployment in the United States was around 10%. So that is a big difference. Now, currently, as we're experiencing the coronavirus pandemic, there are projections of unemployment going to these type of numbers again. However, we don't know yet what that impact will be. So going back to this, well, unemployed people oftentimes are angry. You need something to pass the time. So we see a lot of blame being put on other people for your problems. And eventually, the beginning of World War II leads to an economic boom, which brings many countries out of the Depression. So this we would call something like the war machine. So one of the viewpoints on the Great Depression from, I would say, one of the most famous economists of the 20th century for sure, Milton Friedman, him and another economist, Anna Schwartz, this they call the monetarist view of the Great Depression. They argued that a sharp decline in economic activity in the first half of the 1930s was the result of policy mistakes by the Federal Reserve. So these economists focused on the decline in the money supply from August 1929 to March 1933. So when we talk about monetary policy, that's things like the Fed or the central bank of a country. They try to control the money supply. They do this through things like interest rates or increasing or decreasing demand and supply. So this school of thought noted that the money supply didn't increase in 1928 and 1929, and actually declined 2.6% from August 29 to October 30, when it should have been increased to offset the weakness in the economy. So these monetarists argue that the Depression was consequences of U.S. domestic policies. And they argue that it only had a minimal relationship with international cross-border investment inflows or changes in the price of currencies and deflation in Europe and other countries. Now, that stuff you don't need to memorize, but that's just one viewpoint on why the Great Depression happened. Watch the link in this video to get a quick summary of it from another perspective. Again, there's numerous theories about the causes of the Great Depression. In Manias, Panics, and Crashes, Aliber and Kindleberger argue that declining industrial production and a shrinking credit supply were contributing factors. So they state that industrial production declined rapidly in the few months before the stock market crash. So again, the stock market crash was October 1929. So from June to December, industrial production declined by 28 points. One of the places this was evident was with automobile production. Now you can think about 1920s, cars are big business, especially in the United States. Think of those big American motor companies. They're pumping out a ton of cars in the 20s. People are driving. A lot of people call the 20s the roaring 20s. There is some pretty good increases in standards of living. However, from March 1929 to December, automobile production declined from 660,000 units a month to only 92,500. So these declines cannot be explained by changes in the U.S. money supply. So this would be arguing against that monetarist depiction of the Great Depression. So they argue that this is best explained by the instability in the supply of credit. Now, credit, this is a loan used to make big purchases, right? Things like a car or a house. So instability in the supply of credit and also the reduction in the supply of credit available for purchases as more credit was diverted to the stock market. There was also a big housing boom in the 20s, and along with this, a big rise in indebtedness in the USA. This housing bubble that was growing in places like Florida, similar to what happened in 2006 in the United States, it becomes unsustainable. So eventually more money is needed to be borrowed just to pay interest. So eventually banks will tighten up on the credit, which leads to a decrease in spending and a decrease in securities. So banks become more cautious to lend to stock market participants and to other borrowers. So when the crash finally came and these bubbles popped, the credit system froze. People are not getting any more money for purchases. So what happens is loans to finance imports end up declining sharply, in part because of the sharp decline in the price of imports. Now, we see unemployment across North America skyrocketing. We see the worldwide gross domestic product falling by 15% between 1929 and 1932. What that means is that in 1932, instead of people's wealth increasing, it was actually 15% less. So not only are you not increasing your standard of living, you're actually decreasing it. This takes time then to recuperate from it. You also have drought coming and severe weather ravaging the prairies, especially affecting places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, in Canada at least. So the 30s were also called the Dirty 30s. These images on the screen here, this is from Canada. These dust storms were typical. You can imagine, you're not going to be getting good harvests in this type of time. 2/3 of the people in the prairies were on relief during this. So what happened to Canada in the Great Depression? Well, our social welfare system was inadequate to handle the effects and government's policy to handle it was misguided. A third of Canada's gross national income came from exports. So therefore, when international trade collapses, Canada gets hit really hard, especially in the four western provinces, because a lot of their industry was based on primary product exporting. Again, compare this to current day. Low oil prices in Alberta due to external factors such as Saudi Arabia and Russia and China competing with each other, but then also with the coronavirus pandemic. Projections for Alberta's unemployment are comparable to times like during the Great Depression. So the international trade market collapses, Canada gets hit hard. You see income dropping by 90% for some people in 2 years. Saskatchewan has the lowest price for wheat in recorded history. 66% are forced onto relief. What else was happening? Well, the birth rate and immigration declines also led to low population growth, the lowest since the 1880s. Immigration dropped from 169,000 in 1929 to only 12,000 in 1935. So small numbers are moving into the country. There was also immigrants deported. Almost 30,000 were deported to the country of their origin during the decade, primarily because of illness or unemployment. Think about it this way. You're in a country without a strong economy or social security net. If you're somebody who now has to be put on welfare or you're sick, the government's going to view you as a burden. So, let's just ship you off to where you came from. They can deal with you. During this time period, even many European Jews who were fleeing Nazi Germany were denied sanctuary in Canada during this time. So the Prime Minister at the beginning of the Great Depression, R.B. Bennett, he was the PM from 1930 to 1935. He believed in minimal government intervention. So government's job was not to go into the economy, and the market would get Canada out of the Depression. Now, we end up seeing the Depression changing the way Canadians and Americans think about the economy and also the role of the state. Before and during these years, like in the early part of the Depression with R.B. Bennett, the belief was, have a balanced budget. A sound dollar and changes in trade tariffs would allow private marketplace to recover. So both R.B. Bennett and Mackenzie King, who was prime minister after, shared these views. There were some political reform movements formed in response. In Alberta, the social credit theories of Premier William Aberhart took off. But eventually, we start to see more government intervention. So R.B. Bennett started to expand the role of the state. He raised tariffs to unprecedented levels, trying to focus on Canadian products. He created meager labor camps to try to employ people. He also created the Bank of Canada Act. So what this did was it created the Bank of Canada, which regulated monetary policy. 1935, the Canadian Wheat Board was created. What this did was it established a minimum price of wheat. So even if the price of wheat on a worldwide market had dropped, farmers were guaranteed to get paid a certain amount. Now, we do see these sort of practices being used today. So a lot of the stuff that ends up changing in the economy is stuff that we still use today. So R.B. Bennett, again, he believed in minimal government intervention. He was a millionaire, and so intervening in the economy didn't make sense to him. And so what he was experiencing was juxtaposed with what the average Canadian was experiencing. The image you see here of horses pulling a car, this was something that was called a Bennett buggy. There was no money for fuel, yet people had cars, so they strapped them up to horses. This was something that was seen quite a bit in Canada. Now, in 1940, after a prime minister change to William Lyon Mackenzie King, the federal government assumed responsibility for jobless by creating a national unemployment insurance scheme and also employment service. So during this time period, there's a lot of what we would call deflation. People were reluctant to borrow money. They didn't want to spend it. So investing was low. But when nobody is pumping money into the economy, well, less money is then being used for things like purchases. So more people go out of business, which causes more people to save. So you see this grow and grow and grow. It's a brutal cycle. Now, here's a few images depicting life in the United States. So at the beginning of the Great Depression in the US, president was Herbert Hoover. He's similar to like R.B. Bennett's beliefs. He believed that the free market would work itself out, relieve the country from the brutal conditions it faced. That belief in the market, it really led those first few years. The government's role was not to get involved here. Now, this did not bode well for a lot of people. Many didn't like this, and so a lot of people attributed much of their sufferings to Hoover and his inaction to face the crisis. So you see some shacks here. That's what they called Hoovervilles. So shanty towns emerging from the Depression. The people sleeping on newspapers. Well, they called the newspapers Hoover blankets. And then if you saw somebody with their pockets turned inside out, they called that the Hoover flag. These are ways that people started to mock the president. I mean, it's kind of like a coping method. Now, eventually, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he gains popularity by campaigning on the message that the government was going to help ease suffering. So not take away from the capitalist and free market system. It wasn't about getting rid of that, but the government was going to assist in righting the wrongs of it. So again, we see massive changes in the way people view economics and what the role of the government is here. We see this currently, present day, again, bringing it back to the coronavirus pandemic. Trillions of dollars are being pumped out by countries to try to help stimulate the economy. So the government is taking an active role. This was also done in 2008 in the Great Recession. The government came in and it gave money to try to stop the suffering from becoming unbearable. Now, of course, there's other people who argue that that shouldn't be done. But in general, we see a trend now where the government does get involved. This brings us to the Treaty of Versailles. We've talked about the Treaty of Versailles already, so this isn't new material. But this is probably what we would call the biggest cause of World War II. Now, part of this is because of the war guilt clause. So if you remember, Germany was forced to take full responsibility for causing World War I. Whether you agree with that or not is irrelevant because this is what happened. This humiliated the German people. It also made it easy for Hitler to convince the German people to seek revenge through a second war. So the war guilt clause has a huge impact. We also have our reparations, or the damage payment. So Germany's forced to pay 132 billion gold marks in damages for World War I. 33 billion US dollars, the equivalent of 878 billion in today's money. Not just 878, there's a little typo there. There was no realistic chance Germany could ever pay this debt off. They lost the war. So you also have territory loss. Following the loss of World War I, Germany lost all of its foreign colonies. By 1914, Germany was the third largest colonial power in the world. So having all of this stripped has a big impact. This also includes the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. That's the most humiliating part of all territory losses. They won these in the Franco-Prussian War. Although, if you remember, that's the war that led to German unification. Germany also had military restrictions. They're only allowed to have a standing army of 100,000 people. Naturally, the Germans were afraid that with such a small army, the communist Bolsheviks on their east would invade Germany and spread communism. So Germany's weak military caused a lot of fear and unrest in the German people. So in the 20s, we see something called the Dawes and Young Plan. This was created to try to solve World War I reparations. The main points of the Dawes Plan. Well, the Ruhr area was to be evacuated, and we'll mention that later. Number 2, payments for reparations would begin at 1 billion marks for the first year, increasing annually to 2.5 billion after 5 years, so giving Germany some time to adjust. The Reichsbank, or their central bank, would be adjusted, and this would be done under Allied supervision. So how's Germany going to get the money to pay for reparations? Well, this is point 4. They decided this would include transportation, excise taxes. So these are taxes on goods at the point of manufacturing. Some examples would be things like the taxes you pay on fuel or tobacco and alcohol. And then also customs taxes. Number 5, Germany would be loaned about $200 million, primarily through Wall Street. So that's interesting, right? They're actually being given money by the states. So Germany benefited greatly from this in the 20s. The final plan was then the Young Plan, where we see reparation payments even being reduced by another 20%. Germany's benefiting from this in the 20s, and the result is that France's steel industry is actually hurt. So they couldn't get coal, but at the same time, Germany's being rebuilt. So Germany becomes a dominant steel industry in Europe. This helps with building armaments later on. Some of the things that were being done, you got some of the richest billionaires in the United States, big donors to Republican Party, the Koch brothers. Part of that family's wealth was created early on through their father. He did things like built refineries for both Hitler and Stalin. So Germany's getting helped in this time. Yet France, not so much. Sorry, I skipped a slide there. But when we talk about reparations, it's kind of interesting. So, Germany did actually pay back all of the reparations. Now, it took until 2010, 3rd of October. The reason it took so long was after World War II, Germany split into two countries. They were no longer just Germany, you had West and East Germany. So the two didn't want to have to pay, or one didn't want to have to pay more than the other. So eventually, after reunification in the 90s, Germany did start paying those reparations again. So Germany, though, they actually did this. Now, just an opposing way of thinking about reparations, some actually argue that the reparations were not unfair. Now, reparations, again, these payments that the losing side in a war had to pay, this wasn't uncommon. Example, France had to pay Germany reparations for losing the Franco-Prussian War. The attitude and mindset at the time was, if you fought somebody and lost, well, you're responsible for paying for the cost the winning side incurred. If you would have surrendered in the first place, they wouldn't have had to spend money fighting. So, World War I. Germany had taken much of France under their control. What this did was it gave them forced labor. French citizens who were living in captured territory, they had to work towards the German war effort, because Germany had captured some of the very industrialized areas of France. Germany benefited greatly from French people, land, and capital. So this includes factories. Germany spent the war dismantling French factories, literally taking them back to Germany, setting them up and profiting. So was it actually unfair that Germany owed France some money? Since Germany made so much money from French resources, this wasn't as hard of a financial hit as some may claim. This is one argument, but a different way of thinking about it. Again, though, what Germany was experiencing during this time period is quite severe. I know I don't have this on the slides here, but one of the things Germany was experiencing was hyperinflation in the 20s. So because of the reparations, one of the things in these big costs to Germany, one of the things at the start of World War I that Germany did was they suspended the gold standard. So what this means is that their currency is not tied to gold. The Emperor Wilhelm II and the Reichstag, they decided, you know what, we're going to pay for the war by borrowing money. France, to compare, they imposed its first income tax to pay for the war. Germany thought, hey, we're going to use the money that we received by winning the war to pay off debt. So essentially, Germany thought they're going to win the war and make France pay reparations again. Now they lose the war, so they can't pay these debts back. So what Germany does is it begins printing money without the economic resources to back it. If you just print money in mass amounts, though, it doesn't have worth. This is inflation. So Germany begins to buy foreign currency with marks at any price. But this just increases the speed and the collapse of the German mark, because more and more marks were needed to buy other currencies. In 1922, Germany failed to pay an installment of the reparations to France. This is when we see French and Belgian troops occupy the Ruhr region. So if you look on the page at point 1, the Ruhr area was to be evacuated. France went into the Ruhr region because Germany did not pay them reparations. So we actually see French invasion here of German territory in the 20s. Once France goes into the Ruhr region, Germany actually called for passive resistance. So workers were to do nothing, kind of like a strike. The problem is the government was still printing more and more money to pay them, so increasing inflation. To give you an example of how high the inflation got, 1922, a loaf of bread that cost about 160 marks. Well, the next year, by late 1923, it cost 200 trillion. So the loaf of bread went from 160 marks to 200 trillion marks. I can't even comprehend that. By November 1923, the US dollar, so one US dollar, was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Eventually, Germany had to create a new currency called the Rentenmark. This was tied to gold. Over time, they cut zeros from the currency. They allowed old German marks to be exchanged for the Rentenmark. So over the course of a few years, hyperinflation got dealt with. But this is part of the reason why we see the Dawes and Young plan being made. And this map is showing you Germany's empire before World War I. So these are all the places that Germany lost. Treaty of Versailles, Paris Peace Conference, these places are no longer German territory. Yet you might think the honorable thing would be to give them independence. No. So they just were given to other countries. For example, Cameroon was given to France. And again, pre-post World War I map of Europe, just showing us the change in Europe in between World War I. Because this is important for understanding World War II. The most obvious thing you would see is an increase in the amount of countries. Because if you remember, part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was the belief that ethnic populations should have their own sovereign territory. That's pretty significant. This brings us to the next cause of World War II. Failures of the League of Nations. We've already learned about the League of Nations, so remind yourself about what the League of Nations was. Again, this is that supranational organization created after World War I. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, is kind of the brainchild of it. Yet, the United States doesn't join the League. The whole purpose, though, was that the League of Nations was to prevent future conflicts. How do you do this? Well, the belief was that you would stop aggressor nations from attacking. 1931, the Japanese decide to invade the Chinese territory of Manchuria. The League of Nations did nothing. There's a video link in there too for you. 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was called. League of Nations did nothing. So because the League of Nations ignored aggressive actions by Italy and Japan, Germany decided, why don't we start to test its limits? 1936, Hitler remilitarizes the Rhineland. So that whole 100,000 military, they just kind of ignore that. So the League of Nations, what they did was they adopted a policy of appeasement. Now, this is in hopes of avoiding an armed conflict with aggressor nations. Appeasement basically gives a nation what they want. The hope here is that this is going to satisfy their needs and avoid future issues. It does not work, though. Think of if a bully comes to you in the hallway. Say, give me your lunch money. Right? Okay, maybe I'll give them my lunch money today. And you're thinking, you know what? Because I gave that bully my lunch money today, there's no way he's ever going to come and ask for it again. Wrong. Once you get what you want, you do it again. So the invasion of Manchuria, September 18th, 1931 to February 26, 1932. Right-wing factions of the Japanese military had been pushing the Japanese government to invade Manchuria in order to expand the resource supply of Japan. Government of Japan, the League of Nations, however, did not support the idea. In order to justify an invasion into Manchuria, so eastern China, the Japanese army staged something called the Mukden Incident. So the Japanese actually blew up their own railway in China. Now, by doing this, you can now place the blame on somebody. And here it was placed on the Chinese. So over the next 5 months, Japan went to war with the vastly inferior Chinese army, who was also fighting a civil war at the time. So they successfully occupy Manchuria till the end of World War II. So the League of Nations condemned the action. Like they said, oh, that's such a bad thing to do. But they didn't intervene at all. There was no military force given to this region. The USA did put an embargo on sending oil to Japan, a big deal. The invasion also led to the rape of Nanjing, or the Nanjing Massacre. Between 50 and 300,000 Chinese were killed here. Tens of thousands of women and girls raped in an attempt to breed the Chinese from Manchuria. Tens of thousands of women. Well, that's repeats. Sorry. So here you can see what part of China was invaded. Just some pictures from this time period. So before the beginning of World War II, Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and invaded the Sudetenland. All these were directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. Germany's gained massive amounts of military power. League of Nations sits back and allows it to happen. So part of what we see going on here, and this is another cause of World War II, is the rise of fascism. So fascism is a far-right, totalitarian, ultranationalist government system characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. Now, this comes from the Italian word fascio, which means a bundle. So like in this picture you see, things are stronger when they are bundled together than individually. It's easy to break one twig, but put a bunch of them together and they're much stronger. Now, we put fascism on the far right of the political spectrum. However, it makes more sense to think of the spectrum as a horseshoe, because that far right fascist ends up having a lot in similarities with the far left. So the rise of fascism is relevant to World War II in three nations: Germany under Adolf Hitler, Italy under Benito Mussolini, and Japan under Emperor Hirohito. Now, though, what does ultranationalist mean? It's an important word for us to start getting an understanding of. This is essentially that nationalism to an extreme degree. So your nation's way better than anyone else's, and this is to the point that others don't belong and therefore should be eradicated for purity. Italian fascism. So under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, who founded the ideology of fascism, Nationalist Fascist Party, or the PNF, was created in 1915. They rise to power in Italy in 1921. They rule until 1943. Now, Italian fascism was focused on the ideas of Italian nationalism, so cultural, ethnic, linguistic shared identity of all Italians. Italian syndicalism, so shifting of economic powers to the Italian workers and people. And then revolutionary nationalism, the call for all members of a nation to join together to achieve common goals and achieve a common destiny. Italian fascism rejected classical liberalism. So this is that belief in freedoms, rights, capitalism, small government, those free market laissez-faire ideas. That's classical liberalism. Italian fascism rejected this. Now, they did not call for a revolution such as the French Revolution, but instead they called for all Italians to work to move Italian society forward. This directly opposed Marxist socialism and conservatism. And Italian fascism didn't start off as racist, such as German did, but as Mussolini and Hitler grew closer, it adapted, became more ethnocentric and anti-Semitic. So Benito Mussolini, he's the Italian prime minister from 1922 to 1943. Nicknamed Il Duce, or the leader, he founds Italian fascism. Starts off as a socialist, but gets kicked out of the party for extreme views. Served in World War I until he was wounded in 1917 and was discharged. His experience in the army, though, was responsible for his extreme militant views and his values on unity, obedience, and national pride. Mussolini gained power through his secret police force, so attacks on opposing political parties and his charisma. Now, he inspired and mentored Hitler in the early years of German fascism. So he formed a strong alliance with Nazi Germany, which lasted until Mussolini's death in 1943. So he was executed by an angry mob of Italians. Japanese fascism. Similar to Italy and Germany, fascism in Japan began to emerge following World War I. Japan didn't believe it was treated fairly in the Treaty of Versailles. None of their territorial claims were recognized. So you see a rise in Japanese nationalism. 1920s nationalist and xenophobic ideas, so specifically against the Chinese, begin to emerge in Japan. By 1930, they were adopted by the ruling regime. 1931, Japan invaded the eastern Chinese province of Manchuria to increase food and land for the Japanese people. International community, so the League of Nations, they condemned the Japanese invasion, and Japan was like, all right, peace out. So they left the League of Nations. 1932, right-wing army and naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Tsuyoshi, an anti-fascist. So this ends democracy in Japan and instead consolidates power under the fascist military elite and the Emperor Hirohito. Fascism in Japan was known as Showa statism. So this is an extreme right-wing political ideology that developed after the Meiji Restoration, also known as Showa nationalism. So Hirohito, he was emperor from 1926 until 1989. He's not directly responsible for bringing fascism to Japan. The Japanese tradition states emperor is an inherited position, so the emperor usually was more of a figurehead position. Fascism in Japan was a result of the League of Nations and the US condemning the actions of the Japanese in Manchuria. So the response to this is condemnations by unleashing a wave of nationalism over Japan. Now, when the prime minister was assassinated, Hirohito took political power in order to restore order in Japan. And so through shared nationalist values with the right-wing military leaders, Hirohito embraces a fascist ideology. German fascism. So Adolf Hitler, Austrian-born German citizen, highly skilled soldier for Austria in World War I. 1919, he joins the German Workers' Party, later becoming the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or later then the Nazi Party. So extremely nationalistic, extremely anti-communist. So fascism begins to emerge in 1919, following the Treaty of Versailles. Prior to and during World War I, Germany is under the authoritarian rule of Kaiser Wilhelm II. During this period, Germany unifies, they win the Franco-Prussian War, and nationalism is at an all-time high. Following World War I, Germany becomes a democracy under the Weimar Republic. Now, under the Weimar Republic, many Germans felt the democratic government was weak and sold them out in the Treaty of Versailles. If they were a strong government, well, the Treaty of Versailles wouldn't have been as harsh on Germany, they believed. So many Germans are looking for an alternative to democracy in the 1920s and 30s. While this is all going on, Hitler and the German Workers' Party, they're building a right-wing fascist movement. Hitler and the German Workers' Party, they spent much of the 20s holding rallies or speaking in public and rallying support for their fascist movement. Hitler and the Nazis were inspired by Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy. They brought many of the same right-wing nationalist ideas into their own movement in Germany. Now, Hitler and the Nazis, they focused their beliefs on a few things. So rejecting democracy, rejecting communism, German pride, and Aryan superiority. So we see this ultra-nationalist idea being pushed here. And one of the places this is evident is things like the Nazi youth that existed in the 20s and 30s. In school, people would be taught things like, well, it costs this much to educate somebody without a disability. It costs more money to educate somebody who does have a disability. Therefore, what would be the economic benefit of eradicating all people with disabilities? These are some of the things we see as this nationalism grows and grows. November 8th, 1923. Hitler and the Nazi militia, or the SA, they storm the Reichstag, or the German parliament, in what is called the beer hall push. It fails. So Hitler's arrested, sent to jail for 5 years. Nazi party is banned. Now this failed coup attempt, the beer hall push, took place in Munich. 2,000 Nazis marched in the streets confronting police. 16 died, 4 police died. Now Hitler escaped, but he was arrested 2 days later in the countryside for treason. He saw, though, 3 benefits to the beer hall push, and also their unlawful attempt to seize power. Well, it brought Hitler to the attention of the German nation. Hitler's trial was big. 24 days, he saw it as basically a publicity stunt for his nationalist sentiment. His time in prison was another benefit he saw. He wrote Mein Kampf, his racist and anti-Semitic book that he used as a tool to poison minds. And the final benefit that Hitler saw to the failure of the beer hall push was that gaining power was better if you do it through legitimate means and not through revolution or force. So while in prison, he writes Mein Kampf. He explains his ideology, which is based largely on nationalistic and anti-Semitic views. And Hitler was obsessed with the idea of racial purity. This belief that the Aryan race, or white Europeans, were ethnically superior to all other races. Now, Aryan doesn't mean blonde hair, blue eyes, but that's often the image of it. An interesting story, actually, is that, well, the story goes that the Shah of Persia was so enamored of the racial theories popularized by Hitler that at the suggestion of the Persian embassy in Berlin, he had the name of Persia changed to Iran to illustrate the Aryan roots of his nation. So these ideas had a lot of influence. Mid to late 20s, he focuses on rebuilding the Nazi party. He creates the Hitler Youth, and he also creates his secret police force, the Schutzstaffel, or the SS. Learning from his failed coup, though, he runs in the 1932 election. He receives 36.8% of the vote. Hindenburg won. 1932, the government of Germany is in chaos. 3 consecutive governments had lost power before their full terms had ended. Now, in order for Hindenburg to form a stable government, he decided to appoint Hitler as his chancellor. So essentially the second most important person in German government. January 30th, 1933 marks the birth of the Third Reich, also known as the 1,000-Year Reich. The Germans thought it would last 1,000 years. The Reichstag burns to the ground. Now, Hitler blamed it on the actions of the communists, and he used this to justify violence and oppression of his political opponents. Now, the Nazis actually burnt it down. Despite only having 37% of the seats in government, Hitler was able to scare his political opponents into passing the Enabling Act on March 23rd. This gives Hitler full political power in Germany, so it makes him a dictator. They passed a law in Germany that stated the Nazi Party constitutes the only political party in Germany. Within 3 months, all other political parties, trade unions, and organizations are disbanded, and the new Nazi regime begins building a foreign policy focused on domination and expansion of the soon-to-be German Empire. Hitler withdraws from the League of Nations and begins breaking terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So some of the failures of the League of Nations. Italy invading Abyssinia. So this happens in 1935. This is also known as the Second Italo-Abyssinian War, Abyssinian Crisis. Begins 1935, it lasts 8 months. Italy already held African territories in Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. Over 300,000 Ethiopians are killed in the war. And this is seen as a major failure of the League of Nations, as they failed to A, negotiate a peaceful agreement, and B, stand up to an aggressive nation. Only Germany supported Italy's invasion. Armed Ethiopians drew attention away from what Hitler was doing. So Germany kind of liked this. Germany was actually arming the Ethiopians as well, despite being an ally of Italy. But the longer the crisis lasted, the more attention was drawn away from it. Now watch this clip. This is Emperor Haile Selassie of Abyssinia. This is June 1936. He gives a speech to the League of Nations. Some of what he says is that there's no precedent for a head of state himself speaking in the assembly, but there's also no precedent for people being victim of such injustice and being at present threatened by an aggressor. So he was critical that the League of Nations did nothing to help. He also said the Italian government had violated the covenant and was in a state of aggression. 52 nations in 1935 had promised that the aggressor nation would not triumph, so he calls them liars. It's a powerful speech. Germany breaks the Treaty of Versailles a lot. He writes in Mein Kampf that when he's in power, he's going to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. So in 1934, he begins rebuilding the German army in secret. Later, he just does it publicly. By the end of the war, 13.6 million people serve in the German army. Compare this with the 100,000 troops they were supposed to have. 1936, Hitler moves troops back into the Rhineland. The Treaty of Versailles stated this was not allowed. But again, the League of Nations just does nothing. They're practicing appeasement. 1938, Hitler and Germany annexed the Sudetenland. This is an area in Czechoslovakia which was inhabited by primarily Germanic people. So the land was given to the Czechs in the Treaty of Versailles, but Hitler decides, I'm going to take the German-speaking part of it. The League of Nations actually ends up deciding, okay, you can have the Sudetenland. Now, they don't consult Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations just goes along with this. Hitler also annexes Austria in 1938. Now, this term is called Anschluss. Now, you might remember in the Treaty of Versailles, German and Austria unification was forbidden. Hitler decides, no, we're gonna join. So Germany annexes Austria. This is called Anschluss. Motives for World War II. Japan. They wanted to dominate Asia and the Pacific Ocean. 1937, they had already declared war on China and took the region of Manchuria. Germany. Regain international prestige and power from pre-World War I. Hitler also wanted to create more living space for German people. They called this Lebensraum. So he wanted to eliminate minority groups from German-occupied lands. Italy, they wanted to destabilize the European order. They also wanted to increase Italy's power in Europe. Here we see the wartime alliances. Some similarities, some differences to World War I. You'll notice Italy this time is on the Axis. No flip-flopping this time. Japan is also there. But the Allies, similar to World War I, Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. USA, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Great Britain, Winston Churchill. Well, Churchill comes into power during World War II. These are the allies, though. As you can see, makes up most of the world, let's be honest here. It also doesn't have Canada included there, so that should be blue as well. And then the Axis. So some of the other pre-war major events. Spanish Civil War. Well, Civil War breaks out in Spain. So some of the countries in the area decide to get involved. Italy and Mussolini back the fascist National Party. This is led by Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union backed the current government of Spain. So we call this a proxy war. Both sides end up testing new military technology and techniques. And one of the things that we start to see happening here, which becomes common in World War II, is the bombing of cities with the intention of killing civilians. So don't just limit who you're killing to soldiers, start targeting civilians. Now, the fascist National Party wins the Civil War, and even though they didn't fight in World War II, Franco and the Spaniards backed the Axis. So this is kind of seen as a struggle between fascism and democracy, but it was won by fascism. More accurately, though, leftist revolution and a rightist counter-revolution. This is one of Pablo Picasso's most famous paintings he ever did. It's called the Guernica. So this was painted as a response to the Nazis' devastating casual bombing practice on the Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. So it shows the tragedies of war and the suffering inflicted on individuals, particularly innocent civilians. So another pre-war major event already mentioned, Anschluss, when Germany annexed Austria. March 12, 1938, Hitler marches his troops into Austria with the goal of uniting all German-speaking people under one nation. Again, going against the Treaty of Versailles. Think back to those elements of, aspects of a nation or ethnic nationalism. Language was a big common factor here. Austrian people show overwhelming support towards being part of Germany. And so Austria remains under German control until the end of World War II. Germany given the Sudetenland. So certain regions of the former Czechoslovakia are occupied by long-standing German people. Hitler decides, again, he's trying to unite anyone who speaks German. So he invades Czechoslovakia on September 1st, 1938. In order to avoid the war, League of Nations meets with Hitler in Munich. They sign the Munich Agreement. This agreement gives all German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia to Germany. Now, Germany was not given all of Czechoslovakia in this agreement, but they invaded it anyways in 1939. And again, Czechoslovakia was not invited to this discussion here. The League of Nations in Germany decided. And our last big pre-war major event. This is right before the start of World War II. Quick side note, though, there are people who believe that the start of World War II was as early as the Japanese invasion of Manchuria because of how linked the events are. But for this sake, we'll say it's September 1939. So on August 1st, 1939, the Germans and Soviets sign a non-aggression pact. This was signed between Hitler and Stalin, and it agreed that neither nation would take military action against the other for 10 years. Stalin wanted to avoid a massive loss of Soviet lives, like what they experienced in World War I. Stalin also wanted time to rebuild his military. Now Hitler, he wanted to avoid a two-front war as long as possible. Think back to World War I. The Schlieffen Plan didn't work out. Germany's fighting on the East and West Front. So this agreement also contained a secret agreement where Hitler and Stalin had planned to divide up Eastern Europe amongst the two nations if Hitler was successful in his full war on Europe. Now, this agreement breaks in June of 1941 when Hitler invades the USSR. That's what we call Operation Barbarossa. Now, this non-aggression pact was also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or the Nazi-Soviet Pact because now those names were the two nations' foreign ministers. They also decided here Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Romania would all become spheres of influence. But this ends with Operation Barbarossa.